Good evening. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for this special joint event between the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin and the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israeli Studies at the University of Oklahoma. My name is Jonathan Kaplan, and I am the director of the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies here at UT Austin. On behalf of my colleague, Professor Alan Levinson, who directs our sister center at the University of Oklahoma, I would like to welcome you to this evening's lecture. Both of our centers owe their origins to the visionary philanthropic support of the Schusterman family and the Schusterman family philanthropies. Our centers have for many years exchanged faculty for lectures and gathered faculty for dinners and lunches at conferences. With the advent of the pandemic and the turn to Zoom, we've been afforded new opportunities to collaborate on events, and hence tonight's lecture by Dr. David Koffman of York University in Toronto. I would like to acknowledge our co-sponsors for this event, the Department of Native American Studies at OU, and the Program in Native American and Indigenous Studies at UT Austin. I would also like to thank the Schusterman Center's Administrative Associate, Sablin Arden, and Graduate Assistant Nicole Farrell, and the OU Schusterman Center's Administrative Assistant, Trice Hyman, for their work on tonight's event. As we begin our event tonight, I would like to take a moment to read the land acknowledgement statements from both of our universities. First, OU. Long before the University of Oklahoma was established, the land on which the university now resides was the traditional home of the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. We acknowledge this territory also once served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate Native people. The University of Oklahoma recognizes the historical connection our university has with its Indigenous community. We acknowledge, honor, and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land. We fully recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereign rights of all of Oklahoma's 39 tribal nations. This acknowledgement is aligned with our university's core value of creating a diverse and inclusive community. It is an institutional responsibility to recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up our entire OU community. And now, UT Austin's statement. We'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge the Alabama, Coshata, Caddo, Carrizo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Sleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have been part of these lands and territories in Texas. Before I welcome Professor Levinson to introduce our speaker for this evening, a few practical comments. First, since this is a webinar, you will have to pose your questions, and we very much hope that you will engage in discussion in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. Please feel free to add your questions as you have them. We will only be responding to questions put in the Q&A box, so I encourage you not to send them through chat. Secondly, I will pose these questions to Dr. Koffman after his presentation. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Alan Levinson, who is the Schusterman Joshi Chair in Judaic History and Director of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israeli Studies at OU, and a scholar of modern Jewish history and thought. Professor Levinson.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's great to collaborate with you, and of course I'm thrilled that our two centers can continue finding and bringing fascinating from around the country and beyond. And I'm just very honored to be part of this evening's event. I want to now introduce tonight's speaker. The book that prompted this evening, which I see is this one right here, The Jews Indian, and it is written by David S. Koffman, who is the Richard Shiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry in the Department of History at York University. He's the author of this book, The Jews Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, Rutgers University Press 2019, which won a 2020 Association for Jewish Studies Jordan Schnitzer Book Award. He is also the editor of No Better Home, Jews, Canada, and the Sense of Belonging, University Press 2021. He also serves as the Associate Director of York's Israel and Goldsky Center for Jewish Studies and is the editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes. And so it's with great honor and pleasure that I introduce Professor David S. Koffman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Professor Levinson, and thank you, Professors Levinson, Kaplan, and I think Klein for inviting me and for your enthusiasm about my work. And thank you, Trice and Savelin, for helping make all the arrangements, and of course, to all of you for coming to hear me out tonight. I'm zooming in from Toronto on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, among many others. This is territory that remains subject to what's called the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy and a consortium of Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes region. For this evening, I've prepared a talk that's about 40 minutes, so we should have lots of time for Q&A, what I hope is a genuinely live and open-ended Q&A conversation. I've spent a little over a decade now reading about places where Jews and Indigenous histories intersect, and I believe that these intersections give rise to some broader conclusions about Jewish modernity as a whole. I'm going to come back to these suggestions at the end of my talk, but first I'd like to begin with a brief poke around for the start of the story, because perhaps the Jewish Native American encounter began as soon as Jews arrived in the so-called New World. It's true that Jews were drawn to Turtle Island by the Atlantic colonial triangular trade route, and that the success that led them to settle permanently here rode not just on the financing and supply network of their ethnic and filial connections around the port towns where their brethren and co-religionists lived and with whom they could secure credit, something that's often discussed, but perhaps more fundamentally, it rested on the reliability of a global market for goods. Jewish merchant families entered into the historical drama of the Atlantic Triangle as part of a diasporic merchant minority community, helping circulate fur, gold, arms, seeds, tools, and of course, enslaved human beings between Europe, its colonies, and Africa. Now, the Jews mostly focused on fur, and it was through indigenous access to fur that Jews gained foothold for permanent settlement here. These Jewish merchants became intimately involved in the economic development, the cultural transformations, and all sorts of political fallout in and between a host of nations that this lucrative business and melange of cultural contact inevitably entailed. Their interactions with Native Americans were a complex blend of financial, social, religious, and even sexual relations about which we know rather little in the colonial period. Then again, the Jewish encounter with Native America might have actually begun before Jews' arrival here, with the spurious claim that the Indians of North or South America and or South America, or some portion of them, descended from the lost tribes of Israel or had some other connection to biblical history. The claim preceded the first immigrants by many decades. It was wildly popular, hotly debated, promoted, and discredited repeatedly for an incredible range of differing ends by colonial administrators, scholars, missionaries, eventually by Mormons, and indeed by some Jews for nearly 300 years. The topic is partially recovered by Matthew Doherty's highly recommended new book, Lost Tribes Found, Israelite Indians and Religious Nationalism in Early America. Or perhaps the relationship between Jews and indigenous people began even earlier in the methods and the minds of Spanish civil and religious administrators who, according to anthropologist and cultural theorist Jonathan Boyarin, took what they had learned about managing Jewish difference in the Iberian Peninsula before, during, and immediately after the Inquisition and applied it to the indigenous habitants that they would soon encounter as missionaries and colonizers. The colonized of Europe, perhaps, forged the model into which administrators tried to squeeze Native Americans, according to Boyarin's 2009 book, The Unconverted Self, Jews, Indians, and the Identity of Christian Europe. But the story that I'd like to focus on tonight begins with the Jewish immigrants to the U.S. West that began in the middle of the 1800s, first from German-speaking provinces, and then later from Poland, Romania, and the Pale of Settlement of that other colonial empire that's rearing its imperial head over the last couple of weeks. My aim tonight is to map the broad contours of Jewish Native America, the Jewish Native American encounter from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. And along the way, I'm going to focus on two starkly contrasting individuals who I think neatly capture a specific change over time that I want to illustrate as I try to make sense of the changing postures that American Jews have taken towards indigenous people over that century and in due time up to the present. Jewish men were generally drawn to the West for its commercial opportunities as peddlers or sutlers. These were men who followed infantry brigades to provision them with food and dry goods. These itinerant traders were brought into direct business contact with indigenous suppliers and producers, as well as coal miners, farmers, freemen, boomtowners, men and women. When they accumulated enough capital, these merchants generally established larger merchandising businesses, the famous sort of trading post and later, department stores. They consolidated larger zones of trade, typically moving to an urban center where they could participate in Jewish communal life and settle down with families. Peddling was a kind of a starter job in a startup world. And the genesis of Jewish business success in small towns throughout the country, I think, should be located, at least in part, in indigenous business relations. In the many versions of Out West, Jews enjoyed most of the privileges of whiteness and took advantage of the benefits of American liberalism, motility unencumbered by the state, the absence of government interference into their religious practices or businesses, and emerging state laws that aim to protect their well-being and property and to secure a future for them as individual citizens. Of course, as a whole, Native Americans, as you very well know, suffered a very different fate. They were not even granted citizenship rights until 1924, the very year that Congress shut the immigration gates to Jews. Jews, in other words, were simply part of the broad culture of settlement, or what scholars call settler colonialism. They tended to see Native Americans in one of two ways. Firstly, as impediments to their commercial and settlement aspirations. Violence and the threat of it were real, given the broad fight over the land and its resources, the creation and mobilization of a large military presence in the West, but also of things like immigration policy and of treaty making, all of which aimed to make lands west of the Mississippi available to European and already American settlers. Jews were violent at times. They also applauded it and justified it, and sometimes participated in vigilante violence, to which the state and law most often turned a blind eye. Jews reproduced myths of Indians as bloodthirsty, savage, and all the rest, some of which they had learned from the popular presses and novels and plays that they consumed in Yiddish and German even before their migration, or from letters received by the yet to migrate from those cousins and siblings who had already arrived in the US. Now, when Jews weren't seeing Native Americans as impediments, they saw them as vehicles to achieve their aspirations for both economic mobility and for social belonging. On a practical level, Native Americans were Jews' customers and business partners, But Native America also provided Jews out west some of the metaphysical fodder that they used to produce a sense of belonging or becoming American through celebrating their connections to Native Americans, championing the fact that they got honorifics or telling stories about being taken captive or being adopted or, quote, going native. I listened to one interview taken with an Oklahoma pioneer from the 1937 Works Administration Project with a fellow who told a story of Sam Brown, who died at the age of 100 a year before the interview in 1936. A Jewish boy of 5 years old, and I'm quoting here, Brown had begged a band of Uchis who were making their way off to Indian territory after their removal to take him along with them. Brown lived with them, was apparently adopted into their tribe. He actually later became a treasurer of the Creek Nation and a member of the House of Kings in a place called Wielaka, which is near Leonard, Oklahoma. He became the husband to both a Cree wife and later a Yargi woman. And this interviewee described the tribal funeral of this Jewish lad. All-day services of burial ceremonies and feasting, and the leading men of 4 tribes that paid homage to him: Creeks, Uchis, Cherokees, and Osages. Another quick example, closer to the home for some of you, could be made of the Texas-born Herman Lehmann, captured by Apaches near his home in 1869 at age 10, who learned their dialect of Southern Athabascan and participated as a raider in Apache raids. Caught by rangers a few years later, Texas Rangers, he escaped to the Comanche territory in Oklahoma, where he lived by the name Monteca before he was eventually discovered as white and was persuaded to return to his people by none other than the Comanche chief Connor Parker himself. Eventually, he became part of the Loyal Valley settlement as a good citizen, I'm quoting here, a good citizen who knows that it is wrong to commit murder and that no amounts of provocation under any circumstances could be induced to shed his fellow man's blood. Curiously, Monteca, this fellow, was placed on the tribal rolls for the convention in 1901, and he was actually granted 160 acres of land in Garfield, Oklahoma, which he eventually donated to a school. He later appeared in country fairs and rodeos and eventually wrote a popular book, 9 Years Among the Indians, 1970 to 79. So I want to give you a few more details about one particularly important figure in the story, details about the life of a man named Otto Mears and the literature of remembrance about him as a neat example of the ways that Jews utilized Native America to achieve their twin ambitions of mobility and of belonging. It's a story both about his actions and the ways that they were subsequently memorialized. And it reveals some of the ways that Jewish immigration integration in the West was directly wrapped up in the lives and fates of Native Americans. Mears emigrated from Latvian Kurland in 1852, moved through Germany to New York, and soon found his way to the frontier in search of opportunity. At 19, in 1861, he joined Company H of the 1st Regiment of California Volunteers. Like other Jews who enlisted for both Indian Wars and then later the Civil War, I found dozens of Jewish soldier names over decades, lots in Texas actually, Edward Johnson, Benjamin Mordecai, M.K. Moses, Herman Ehrenberg. Like these and many others, Otto Mears saw gaining military experience as a noble route to legitimation. For 3 years during the Civil War, he served under Kit Carson in his campaign against Navajo in New Mexico. And after his discharge, he worked as a clerk for a series of Jewish German merchant film firms there and in Arizona. He opened his own trading post in Conejos, Colorado, and parlayed success upon success as a merchandiser, a farm and land speculator, a road and eventually railway builder and developer. Like other German-speaking Jewish immigrants to the frontier West, Mears was not a lone actor, but a man networked by his religious and linguistic and filial connection. The state of Colorado hired Mears as an interpreter in 1873 to work on failing negotiations between Ouray, the chief of the Ute, and Felix Bruneau, chairman of the Board of Indian Commissioners, in its effort to secure contiguous counties of Ute land. The land grab, like most of them at the time, was justified in the language of productivity, since linking together newly acquired tracts was key for commercial development. One local newspaper of the day opined that these lands were currently, quote, only a broad, beautiful expanse of meadowland over which the Utes hold unquestioned control. But these favorite grounds of the Utes would, if occupied by us whites, become one of the richest and most productive grain and fruit growing counties in the West. A member of the state legislature argued that, quote, all of the Ute territory bring no revenue to the government. On the contrary, the natives are supported at great expense. The same land thrown open to settlement would support many rich and prosperous communities that would return to the national government. Of course, the struggle over the land was fierce and two-sided. New hostilities erupted in the fall of 1879 when the Utes at the White River Agency killed Nathan Meeker and 8 Indian sub-agents, including incidentally at least one Jew, Carl Goldstein. Several settlers were taken into captivity, and Mears was called upon to intervene as a negotiator, and he secured the release of the captives. In the wake of what subsequently became known as the Meeker Massacre, popular sentiment in Colorado supported the forced removal of the remaining Utes. It was rumored that Mears privately circulated among them, here's a quote too, giving each $2 in silver to sign away land rights. For this, he was brought up on bribery charges. He was ordered to Washington to stand trial, although there he was exonerated and then actually reimbursed for his layouts by the feds. Now, later local history books championed the ways that, quote, Mears and his fellow pioneers had wrestled control away from the painted wards of Uncle Sam, the red wards of Uncle Sam, who guard every acre with a jealous eye. After the government took control over the land, Mears helped find what they called suitable reservation lands for the Utes along the Green River at the present site of the Uinta Reservation in Utah, and then helped build the infrastructure for a new Indian agency there. Next, he built private toll roads through the Arkansas Valley into the San Juan, establishing mining interests and securing lucrative mail carrier contracts to supply settlers with tobacco, coffee, and sugar and other dry goods and foodstuffs, taxing the cargo of his competitors since he owned the land, owned the roads. He also started a newspaper in 1872 at Saguache to promote the San Luis Valley for more new settlers. And with his considerable resources by the mid-70s, he began building the Rio Grande Southern, one of several Mears-owned railroads, to help link up the resources of the Mountain West with markets on both coasts. Mears was, in short, an active participant at various stages of the forced removal of distinct Native American nations, the dispossession of their lands, the subsequent containment, and the commercialization of the newly acquired and sometimes untreated lands. His ascendance from an orphaned immigrant to an Indian war soldier, from a settlement broker to a wealthy and powerful, and then eventually elected member of the Colorado legislature, and then indeed to be one of the so-called founding fathers of the state of Colorado, rode on these key pieces of settler colonization. Similar stories might be told of other folks, for example, Leo Meyer, who arrived in Sire, Oklahoma in 1892 to clerk in his uncle's store next to the Cheyenne Arapaho Reservation. Soon after, he was elected to the Board of Trustees and later served on the 1906 Constitutional Campaign Act that turned the Indian Territory into the state of Oklahoma. Now, celebrations of men like Meyer or Mears's contributions, both as businessmen and as so-called pacifier of Indians, would frequently be repeated in the popular press and in local history works long after their deaths. In particular, Jewish journalists and amateur historians of the Jewish Western experience from the late 19th century all the way through the 30s and 40s at least celebrated their triumph over Indians and the acquisition of their land as a means of emphasizing Jewish belonging in both the physical geographic landscape as well as the socially and sort of affectively in the national spirit. Now, I hadn't sought them out when I scoured the Jewish archives for sources about Native Americans for this project, but I found no shortage of glory stories like these, some of which are actually quite gory. stories that were meant to transmit messages by Jews for Jews about Jews, Jews who lynched, Jews who shot, who scalped Native Americans, and who were praised for acquiring Indian lands. There were, of course, other success stories told of Jews who acquired Indian land without recourse to violence, men like Asher Silberstein and Solomon Meyer, who acquired tens of thousands of acres of land from the Kaw Reservation Indians in 1902, and soon after the Kiowa and Comanche reservations, both in Oklahoma, all three in Oklahoma. Now, these stories regularly circulated in local Jewish histories, obituaries, personal letters, and memoirs in Alaska, from Alaska to Arizona, Missouri to Montana, Nebraska to Nevada, in New Mexico, South Dakota, Texas, Wyoming. 2 generations of Jewish communal record keeping and local historical consciousness situated Jews at the center of what the cultural historian of the American frontier, Richard Slotkin, has called narratives of regeneration through violence. Stories about Jewish victimization from Indian cruelties, as they were called, also circulated. They mirrored but reversed the stories of violent perpetration, but they resulted in the same sorts of conclusions and narrative plots and civic lessons. They explained and justified the seizure of Native American land and the sacrifice that warranted and sanctified imperial victory, a kind of American libertarianism. In telling stories of both varieties, Jews identified as model national subjects who took up the charge of settling, civilizing, and Americanizing the land. They perpetrated violence and fell victim to it, not as Jews per se, but rather as part of the settler population. Yet Jews wrote about these participations as acts of Jewish sacrifice and Jewish brawn, as a way to strike against the myth that they lacked the muscular ruggedness to make them fit for the expansion enterprise, fusing physical violence and political might. As, for example, with David Spangler Koffman, no relation to this David Koffman, the Pennsylvania-born lawyer and later the first Jewish House of Representative reps of Texas, who participated in military campaigns against the Cherokee, was wounded in battle back in 1839, whose obituaries regularly referred to both his Indian fighting prowess and his political accomplishments. Jews wrote with a profound awareness of the reversal of their recent experience in Europe, where they had suffered as the colonized. These narratives of perpetration and victimhood earned Western Jews a sense of home among an emerging nation of whites. They were acts to end exile. Now, as scholars of Indigenous history have shown in great detail, displacement was devastating to Native American communities. It disrupted traditional knowledge, practice, changed food, economics, culture, language, had a massive death, disease, and trauma toll. While Native American communities tended to suffer geographic dislocation, political disorder, and cultural disruption in the West, Jews achieved stunning social mobility there, religious latitude, relative economic security, and created scores of new communities. In the words of William Toll, a historian of Pacific Coast Jewry, for Jewish men, the merchant role in the West enabled them and their families in a single generation to move from medieval artisanship and itinerant merchandising to the highest civil status. And within a few short decades after the so-called closing of the frontier, the plot line of Jewish-Native American relations pivoted rather dramatically. With the violent contest for land largely over, enfranchised and mostly American-born Jews of the mid-20th century East Coast, here I'm thinking about lawyers, anthropologists, linguists, educators, journalists, even a few rabbis, expended considerable effort at what they called Indian uplift and promoted some of the most effective tools of progressive pro-Native ideology and policy that America had ever created. And to help characterize this next very different sort of Jewish-Native American encounter, let me introduce you to our second figure for this evening, the lawyer, legislator, and advocate for Native American rights, Felix Cohen. Born in 1907 in Yonkers, the son of the famed legal philosopher Morris Raphael Cohen, Felix was one of a significant number of Jews who devoted expertise, time, energy, money, and political capital to various efforts aimed at improving the lives of American Indians during the middle decades of the 20th century. His work offers a crystallization of an entire cadre of mid-century Jewish liberals and socialists and progressives' work and their sensibilities as they helped fashion the Roosevelt administration's Indian New Deal in the 1930s under the leadership of John Collier, who was the non-Jewish commissioner of Indian Affairs and the head of the Department of the Interior. Now, these Jews worked at the top echelons of leadership, drafting and shaping Indian policy and federal law. They also helped launch, fund, and staff some of the most important not-for-profit efforts at advancing Native Americans of the day, including the Association on American Indian Affairs, the Indian Rights Association, the National Congress on American Indians, the American Indian Defense Association, and many more. They shared and were shaped by a common sociology of community organizing, of faith in the law as a vehicle for social change, and a Jewish sensibility inculcated by their communal attachments. They worked assiduously on Indian affairs after the demise of the Indian New Deal as well, deep into the conservative post-World War II reactionary period known in Native American historiography as termination. So this is deep into the 60s and well beyond that. Close to home for some of you this evening, and some maybe, the Jewish lawyers and lobbyists Arthur Lazarus and Marvin Sanofsky worked closely with North Carolina's Senator Sam Ervin to ensure that the Indian Civil Rights Act of '68 adequately safeguarded tribal autonomy, particularly with respect to reservation, self-policing, and certain other aspects of criminal jurisdictions. Now, there are a lot of examples that I could draw on here, but the evidence is just meant to illustrate the straightforward point that mid-century American Jews were engaged in a rich and complex critique of U.S. imperialism and its past government's mistreatment of Native Americans, and they played a major part in many of its first and earliest, the government's first and serious attempts at redress, using the tools of the state itself. Jews' efforts both inside and outside government shows that Jews played an outsized role in establishing some of the key institutions, techniques, and organizations that Native American leaders themselves would use to expand their power and capacity later in the 20th century. Enfranchised Jews working in law firms at the nation's capital and for not-for-profit organizations, lobby groups, academic institutions were steadfast and I think utterly sincere in their wishes to improve the lives of communities of Native Americans around the country, just as they had for the rights and enrichment of many American minority groups, African Americans chief among them, something we know a lot about. For these liberal Jewish actors, advancing Native America was but one prong of the broader goal of advancing all groups whose rights and cultural self-determination needed securing, and ensuring that individuals from any group would receive the protection of the law to shape their own cultural, economic, and religious destinies. These are the values to which they were committed. And from his coming of age until his death at 46, Felix Cohen's intellectual and political pursuits centered on Indian rights. His wife, Lucy Kramer Cohen, was an anthropologist trained by the Jewish godfathers of American anthropology, Franz Boas and Edward Sapir. She remained active and connected to the group of Boas and Sapir's largely Jewish students who put the anti-racist, cultural relativist discipline of anthropology onto the map and into American universities by focusing by and large on Native American subjects, which is another fascinating meeting place of Jewish and Native American histories, but a topic for another night. Cohen's vision for Indian Renaissance was of a piece with the most progressive strand of non-Native ideas for Native Americans at the time. The Department of the Interior tapped a group of young lawyers, including Cohen, Nathan Margold, a half a dozen other Jews, a few Gentiles, and a Mormon, and authorized them to begin working on major legislation to try to reverse the problems associated with all the assimilationist policies that had been in effect since the Dawes General Allotment Act of 1877. Their brainchild, the Indian Reorganization Act, or the IRA, also known as the Wheeler-Howard Act, passed in 1934. It was the first federal Indian policy in more than 100 years that did not have the explicit purpose of undermining the status of Indian nations. On the contrary, the IRA aimed to fundamentally reformulate national Indian policy to set the government's goal as the establishment of Indian self-governance and to provide Native American communities with sufficient authority and powers to represent reservation populations. The IRA aimed to promote cultural pluralism, tribal sovereignty. Among its many provisions, it also ended the practice of dividing up reservation lands into small parcels and giving them to individual Indians to farm or to sell. And it allowed Native Americans to voluntarily exchange allotments so that Native groups could consolidate lands instead of living on these checkerboarded reservations. It restored tribal ownership to the remaining surplus lands created by the implementation of the old allotment system, tens of thousands of acres, and provided Indians with economic aid and appropriated annual funds for the acquisition of additional land for the landless. Now, the IRA was law, interestingly, only for the tribes who opted in and wanted to be governed by it. Tribes had the right to exclude themselves from the provisions of the IRA altogether if they wished. The drafters didn't want the IRA to become one more wave of top-down legislation. Tribes that accepted the act could draft constitutions defining their own powers of self-government and establish business charters that permitted them to borrow money from a revolving credit fund. Now, more than 2/3 of eligible tribes voted to accept the IRA, and more than 1/3 wrote constitutions, some of which Felix Cohen himself helped draft. The IRA, perhaps most radically, authorized tribal councils that were established under the act itself to negotiate with and to litigate against the federal, state, and local governments in what would soon be established under its provisions as the Indian Claims Commission, which was a kind of parallel court for tribes to sue the government for damages. The Indian Reorganization Act was an unusually liberal gesture of Congress in that legislators created laws that rescinded governmental powers, like not as an attempt to shrink government agencies for right-leaning conservative ideological reasons, but in order to provide redress for its own failings, aware of the impacts that centuries of law, policy, and war had made on Native Americans. The opportunities made available to tribes under the act were, in the assessment of Native American legal historians Vine Deloria Jr. and Clifford Little, immense. Now, Cohen's accomplishments went still further. He assembled and redacted the Federal Handbook of American Indian Law in 1940, a compendium resource of all the states and federal legal proceedings on matters of Indian law to date, a book that became known as the, quote, Bible for the American Indian Bar. And after he left government service, he interpreted the IRA that he helped write as an attorney hired by tribes now to represent them in their legal battles against the government at the Indian Claims Commission that he helped create. So he and many other Jewish litigators won hundreds of millions of dollars in awards for their client tribes. There was actually a legislative process as well as a litigious one for earning monetary recompense for Native peoples, I should point out. Arthur Lazarus, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier, drafted the Native version of what would become the landmark Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which was perhaps the largest cash settlement for extinguishing land title ever negotiated between a conquering sovereign and an indigenous people anywhere. It was just under $1 billion in 1971. Now, for his part, Cohen also wrote dozens of articles, editorials, letters to the editors of major American newspapers concerning contemporary legislative issues of import to Native Americans, ceaselessly observing misconceptions about indigenous people and calling out the settlers' unfair treatments of their indigenous communities. We have disposed of them, he wrote in one, spiritually by denying their existence as a people, by taking refuge in the myth of the vanishing Indian, or by blaming our grandfathers for the wrongs we commit. In this way, we have assured ourselves that our national sins are of purely antiquarian significance. They are not. Now, Cohen saw Indian advocacy work as inextricably linked with the work of defending all minorities, and Jews were very much on his radar. He coupled nearly all of his appeals for anti-discrimination law and public opinion about Jews with appeals on behalf of other American minorities. Also, like other Jews of his cohort, He also worked on Jewish immigration and minority recognition issues. He worked on the American Jewish causes with a slew of U.S. organizations, like most importantly, the American Jewish Committee, but also internationally on Jewish issues. He worked with France's Alliance Israélite Universelle and British Jewry's Anglo-Jewish Association. He even penned one of the earliest memoranda on the prevention of discrimination and the protection of minorities ever submitted to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. He was also explicit in his own writings about why. He argued that Jewish and Native American traditions were at the root of the most elemental virtuous qualities of America itself. In one address he gave to graduating law students at Yale entitled The Meaning of Americanism, Cohen aimed to elucidate the sources that he thought lay at the heart of America's noblest virtues, the twin influences of Judaism and Native American culture. On the one hand, he judged America's foundational ideal, its core moral imperative, to be the Hebrew Bible's injunction to care for the stranger. This beckoning, according to Cohen, undergirded the best of the nation's attitude towards immigration, its social welfare innovations, domestic public policy. It animated America's purpose. Yet in order to operationalize this foundational ideal in practical political terms, it had to be combined with a second influence, according to Cohen, which was what he called the nation's spirit of tolerance, which he located in the Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that I mentioned in my land acknowledgements, half an hour ago. This was the indigenous political pact that had long enshrined the cooperation of the 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later a 6th, Tuscarora Nation, the so-called people of the Longhouse. Admiring the skills that Native American leaders had at forming political confederations, he said, and avoiding violence, underwrote the experience and wisdom necessary for America's very system of government, its libertarian yet communalistic tolerance. Cohen, in other words, traced the 2 most fundamental ingredients for his vision of America's highest ideals to Jews on the one hand and Native Americans on the other. He paired his investments in Jewish and Indian issues throughout his career in practical terms too, not just talk. His Indian advocacy began in the rise of the shadow of the Nazi rise to power in the mid-30s, right up to his death in 1953. Reflecting back on 2 decades of Jewish and Indian advocacy just months before his death, he gave further voice to the motivations that drove his work, writing, "We have a vital concern with Indian self-government because the Native American is to America what the Jew was to the Russian czars and Hitler's Germany. For us, Americans, the Indian tribe is the miner's canary, and when it flutters and droops, we know that the poison gases of intolerance threaten all other minorities in our land." Yet Cohen's and his Jewish colleagues' advocacy efforts, I should say, were circumscribed. These Jews lacked both the intimate knowledge of and deep existential ties to Native Americans' experiences, their languages, their attachment to their lands, and their visions for their own futures. The intellectual and political perspectives that mid-century Jews assumed to be good for all American, quote, minorities, which included an almost sacrosanct view of the state of statist liberalism and an idealistic confidence in the tools of lobbying, public policy making, education, and the law to effect change. These really limited these Jewish contributions to reshaping Native Americans' well-beings and their communities' futures as they themselves might have wished it. Their work also betrayed some of the assimilationist impulses that American Jews accepted as a fundamental given of the American Jewish experience. On a basic level, they assumed that all so-called minorities shared a vision for a more inclusive nation. And when these Jewish professionals grappled with the terrible impacts of colonialism on Indigenous communities, they assumed that Native Americans were, in this sense, like other immigrant groups who saw themselves as minorities. Right? They did not put forth a vision for decolonizing America. They did not speak of Native American nations as autonomous nations able to engage in nation-to-nation negotiations. They were far less vociferous about ensuring the full expression of Native Americans' political self-determination. They also based some of their interventions less on deeply informed indigenous ways of knowing and more on the things that they did know. So those tribal constitutions, for example, that Cohen wrote, were primarily based on ideas about municipal governance, about city politics, not the deeply rooted political customs of the specific tribes to which they were offered as constitutions. They assumed also, for example, that money could be substituted for land. This is perhaps best exemplified by the Black Hills Sioux land claims, where Marvin Sanofsky and Arthur Lazarus, the lawyers I mentioned, who were also lawyers who represented the Sioux for 27 years in and out of the courts from 53 to 1980, when they finally convinced the court that the U.S. had illegally stole the Black Hills of South Dakota in 1877 and won a settlement that was then worth $105 million, only to have $105 million, only to have the cash settlement rejected by the Sioux. That payment, which is still on the table and now valued at about $1.5 billion, is still rejected, by the way. The idea being that cash can't replace the land, they want the land. Again, more broadly, Jews like Cohen pursued a politics of justice through incorporation into the benefits and virtues of America, using and trusting the tools of the state. So they certainly grappled with the painful legacies of colonization, but they did so in ways that made sense to them as Jews, as mid-century Jews, and in ways that fit their commitments to liberalism and the framework of national pluralism. Still, Cohen campaigned for American Indian legal rights and recognition more intensely than any other American Jew, and more than most other non-natives had done in all of American history, I think it's safe to say. And he did so with some measure of Jewish self-consciousness. His identification with Native American issues illustrated in a nice concentrated manner how these mid-century Jewish liberals tried to mediate between their status as political insiders and minority outsiders, or between power and powerlessness in American civil life. Occupying this middle zone served several simultaneous functions. It allowed enfranchised Jews like Cohen and the lawyers and boosters and board members of a panoply of Indian rights organizations, still absorbed with the memory of recent historical experience of Jewish disempowerment, to feel both settled in America and Jewish by, quote, identifying down with Americans whose collective corporate fate had fared far worse than those of the Jews' fate in America. It also allowed Jews to enact their devotion to liberalism and foster the American institutions that they cared for: tolerance, equality, the rule of law, protection and preservation of minority rights. These outcomes, they believed, would secure the brightest future for America and all of its minorities, Jews and Native Americans included among them, from their perspective, because they had seen the ways that these principles of liberalism, American liberalism, had served their own immigrant families and communities. All right, so much for my second case study. But to be sure, there were many other interesting theaters in which Jews and Native Americans met and imagined and discussed one another, into which we might delve, that emerged at specific moments of the 20th century or the 21st century. About there is little to no scholarship yet. The 19-teens, 20s, and 30s was home to an elaborate discussion about race, biology, medicine, and character during this time, when Jewish scientists and civic leaders discussed the relative placement of Jews to American Indians in race thinking and eugenics. Much of their use of Indians during this time centered around immigration restriction, combating what they called nativism, strangely, xenophobia. It was about who was fit to immigrate. There also was and remains, of course, a tense debate about comparative genocide that began in the 1960s. There are many subsets of businesses and cultural encounters around things like the casinos or the energy sector or the arts and cultural world of arts and culture, where Jews and Indigenous people have pretty interesting connections. And then there's what to say about Jewish and Native American entanglements, about spirituality, about land-based religion and environmentalism. And most recently, there's a tense discourse that has emerged about Israel-Palestine and the idea of indigeneity and the ways that Jewish and Indigenous voices, add to this complex in this complex debate. At this point, though, I want to steer us to some of the broad conclusions that I think can be drawn from the encounters that I did focus on tonight. Jews of the frontier who acted as agents of settler colonialism, seeing Indians as impediments to their immigrant aspirations for inclusion and for social economic mobility, and the enfranchised Jews of the mid-20th century, the lawyers and social scientists and others who expended considerable effort at Indian uplift and promoted some of these really effective tools of pro-native ideology. Now, perhaps the thorniest implication that arrives from this change over time that I've presented is that rather than see the American Jewish experience only as an immigration story, it might be accurate to see Jewish immigration history as part and parcel of the complexities of colonial history, really part of the global histories of displacement and the incredible geographic rearrangements that shaped the lives and locations of so many millions in the last century and a half. We get something new when we see ethnic and religious communities' migration histories from the vantage point of those most dramatically impacted by mass migration modernity. And this is not just an American story. Indeed, there are similar patterns, and we need to ask similar questions or related questions about these similar processes with respect to Canada and Latin America and the Caribbean, Australia and New Zealand, and even pockets of Southern Africa. Now, if there's a broad insight about Jewish history to take from the research that grew into this book, from which my talk tonight was based, I think it's that there are real limits to the basic framework in which the field of modern Jewish history is generally cast, which is emancipation, too centered perhaps on the Western European model. In the so-called New World, citizenship rights were really never up for debate and were never really a problem. Yes, Jews migrated for these rights, but they also migrated for food, for security, and for religious latitude as well. But the liberalism of the New World colonies worked, and the conditions for Jewish immigration became possible because of global capital expansion and because the resources that European empires captured. So Jewish movement around the globe simply has to be seen in the context of what made it possible. I think the central insight that arises from attunement to the Jewish-Indigenous relationship might be that the American Jewish past is burdened because the history of multinational mass migration that produced America is the history of colonialism, just as modernity is a mass modernity migration. So colonialism and immigration they connote different things, but they denote the same thing. And I'd argue that immigration, even refugee immigration, is colonial history. They're just flip sides of the same coin. American Jewish history ought to be seen not just as a heroic story of immigrant ascent and accomplishment, but as part and parcel of the juggernaut of modernity, which is colonialism. The massive waves of immigration that relocated millions of Jews from Europe and Asia to its peripheries in settler societies and colonial outposts over the long 19th century was a transformation as profound as any change in the history of the Jews. And I think it's into this context that I suggest American Jewish history ought to be understood, part of the history of conflict and contest and the politics and the possibilities that emerged from settler societies. So the story that I've told this evening likewise complicates the long romance of Jews and liberalism, because it shows, I think, accurately and perhaps a bit painfully, that Jewish devotion to liberalism has included some of its most noble, but also some of its most promiscuous elements. And widening the aperture of American Jewish history to include the uncomfortable fact of colonialism doesn't entirely undo the story that we know and tell about American Jewish life, which is an immigrant success story, but it does complicate it. The fact that Jews were among the colonizers in a process that clearly harmed Indigenous people and lives doesn't alter the need that Jews felt to migrate from Europe and Russia. And it doesn't alter the tribulations or the accomplishments of Jews once arrived, but it does ask us to contend with these politics of mass migration and to consider the consequences for Jews, for Indigenous people, and perhaps even some fundamental ideas about America itself. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Please join me in extending a kind of virtual hand clap and thanks to Professor Koffman for a wonderful and engaging lecture this evening. Uh, we're open now to time for question and answer. So I want to remind you that if you have a question of Dr. Koffman, to please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, and please type that in, and we will. I'll read those questions out loud as they come in. So our first question is from Andy Magid, in which he asks, are the theories of Cyrus Gordon and before Columbus regarding pre-Columbian contact of Jews and the peoples of the Americas also spurious? And I think this was kind of an early moment in your lecture when you were talking about the 10 tribes. I don't know if you've encountered Cyrus Gordon's work on those topics.
I don't know Cyrus Gordon's work in particular. Well, I'll certainly look it up. Let me make a note of it. And maybe we can email about it. I haven't really done that much work on the kind of crypto, the crypto Jews and the kind of Columbian expeditions and the claims about the Jewishness. So I don't know. I think maybe though what I would say is, so the honest question is I don't know if they're spurious or not, but I'm kind of more interested in how these claims are taken up and are understood and what meaning they're put to. So this is kind of like a lot of the work that I presented about the colonial frontier Jews. There's something to be said for what happened, and there's something to be said for the meaning that's made about what happened. So my instinct would be to lean into that direction, but this is not an area that I know a lot about. Sorry.
Professor Levinson, do you want to follow up on that? Or?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask David another question, and I'm not technically adept enough to put it in the Q&A. So my question is about Jewish historiography and indigeneity. And just generally, how have you dealt with the challenge of, and this seems to me, whether you're talking about Canaanites in the ancient world or Native Americans before, Sequoia enabled, a written record. How do you deal with the challenge of balancing a very hypertextual, hyperliteral tradition like Jewish culture with other traditions that are less textually oriented? It seems to me that's a big challenge.
Yeah, that is a challenge. And it's a question that actually works on a couple of different levels. There's a methodological kind of problem about sources, and I'll say something about that. But there's also a much more challenging conceptual and historiographic problem about orality and literacy. With respect to sources, I would say that, I started this project as a student of Jewish history, of American Jewish history, and was curious about it. And I did not intend to kind of make an intervention such as I did. I was really trying to gather sources and try to make sense of them. So everything that I kind of came to conclude about colonialism and Jewish modernity was a result of reading sources. And I went to find Jewish sources about Native Americans, not the other way around. The other way around would have been better in an ideal world had I done both and made it a truly dialogical project, which it's not. I tried to encode this, this letdown, this disappointing fact that I didn't do two projects in one, but just did one, into the title of this kind of slightly awkward title of this book, The Jews Indian, where the Jews are the subject and the Indians are the object, because that's the reality of the study that I did. How did Jews understand, interact with, make use of both real people and ideas about indigeneity? That's the subject and thesis of this book. I would have loved to be able to do a proper dialogical book, but first of all, I'm not skilled enough and don't know nearly enough about Native American history to be able to do this sort of from the other side. I have some thoughts about why it might be useful, but this is really not my place to say. I'd be curious, hopeful that it could be done. The second point is in the more kind of abstract puzzle and problem is about orality and literacy and about ways of knowing. And it's true that we Jews are an extremely literate people, which is not a compliment or a degradation, but a kind of fact. We have invested a lot of our way of being, our sensibility, our epistemology, our culture in textuality. And, for the most part, Native American indigenous culture is not that way. And orality is not illiteracy. It's an entire worldview with immense amount of human capital, of deep knowledge, there's a little bit of a gap there. So I think this is something that's to be explored. And is just a little bit in some of the dialogues that are started to happen between Jews and Indigenous people in Canada and the United States in the last few years, but I'd be curious to hear more about it and learn more about it. There's one quick example that I'll share if I could, which is about the writing of recent writing of residential school trauma. So there's a colleague here in Canada who's noted an Order of Canada philanthropist and scholar named Michael Dan, who has noted very presciently that there appears to be no First Nations writer who wrote about the residential school experience and the trauma of residential schools as it was happening. And this is very different from the Holocaust and life in the ghettos and the camps, where Jews were literally writing as it was happening. And that was incredibly important for them to write about it as it was happening. And for Indigenous people, deeply traumatized by this menacing, horrible institution in Canada and the United States, are only starting now. Residential schools, last one was closed not that long ago, 20, 30 years ago, but are only starting to write about 3 generations or 2 generations removed of this trauma and trying to make sense of it sort of in writing. So there's something very interesting, to explore further, and I don't have many good answers about it, but it's a fascinating topic.
I want to go back to your first response, which is a kind of methodological question. Is it possible, do you think, obviously this is not your area of expertise, but coming from engaging the sources to some degree, do you have a sense that it's possible to write a kind of history of Native American perceptions or Indigenous people's perceptions of Jews in North America?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It may not go back. It's a question of how far it would go back. I think one of the interesting things that that scholarship might try to cover is when and how did different specific nations develop language that accounted for the kinds of differences that matter to settlers. So the starting point is that in different languages and different culture areas, there are different categories for understanding people outside of the us, of the we, of the people. And the idea that of national origins, for example, wouldn't have been all that meaningful at the turn of the 19th century to various tribes. That what might have mattered was whether these potential business partners were trustworthy, whether they extended credit. It might have mattered whether they were missionizing or not. So religion sort of might have mattered. And when did different Indigenous groups develop categories that kind of matched and mapped and morphed around the categories that were used by settler populations? So that's interesting. And where do Jews appear here as part of the question? I suspect that a lot of early ideas that many Indigenous peoples learned about Jews were from Christian missionaries, and it's wrapped up in the sort of long history of Christian ideas that come to mix in with Native American cosmologies and ideologies and philosophy and stuff like that. So that would also be a pretty interesting thing to appear. But I suspect that a lot more of this history would be like later 20th century work as well. And I think that both genocide and sort of Indigenous discussion about the word and thinking about the Holocaust and thinking about Indigenous genocide would be a very important chapter of this book, as would more contemporary, last couple of decades discussions about indigeneity with respect to the biblical land of Israel, with Israel Palestine, and who is indigenous, and is Zionism a colonial enterprise, or is it a anti-colonial enterprise, or is it a post-colonial enterprise, right? And we do see, in sort of the world of American Indian letters and Indian country Indian country newspapers and editorials and intellectuals that are really kind of all over the map, or not all over the map, but on both sides of the story. Jews on the one hand are seen as colonial actors in the Middle East, either as Europeans or as pawns in the British and then American imperial ambitions for the region, but sometimes are also seen as a great example of a, kind of religious, cultural, ethnic minority who got the shit kicked out of them in Europe, who, reclaimed sovereignty rights, political rights, language revitalization, and are seen as a great model for Indigenous revitalization because it's a post-colonial project and not a colonial project. This is a debate that you can see in the world of Native American intellectual circles. So I think that would be a pretty interesting project too. Maybe something that I undertake at some point, or something that someone else can pick up, because it's pretty interesting.
It sounds like a fascinating project, and I really appreciate you kind of lining those trajectories out, because it really does sound like a part two to your work would, on this project would be great, but certainly
maybe in partnership, something co-authored.
Not by me. It's about 2,000 years past the stuff.
Not by you. Okay. Of course.
Perhaps Professor Levinson can work with you on that. So one of the questions was posed by Marshall Gimple. Do the patterns of Jewish-Indian interaction in the Canadian West and East parallel those in the United States, or do you see some substantive distinctions between them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, for the most part, I like to emphasize the similarities, because I think the kind of global picture is sort of the most important thing to say. And if I'd done some of the work about the Canadian Jewish Indigenous encounter, and I would say it has pretty similar patterns. The timing is a little different. Everything kind of shifted out to a little bit later in the 20th century, but I'd say it's overall fairly similar. There are differences that maybe can be found, but they probably have more to do with the size of the Jewish population in Canada as compared with the States. So and maybe a little bit to do with Canadian federal policy, but it's pretty similar. And I would also argue, although I haven't done so much of the work, that there's a pretty similar story to be told about Jews in Australia and New Zealand and other places as well, as I alluded to. And I would say that my instinct is like, we should emphasize what's in common first, and then see the subtle differences, but just see them as differences of value and of quality and not of quantity, or of quantity and not quality. Like they're substantively the same.
Right.
And then we'll get into what the meaning of the differences are. But I think it's most important to have the big insight about the commonality. Yeah, South Africa and Chad for sure.
Of course, yeah. So Misha Klein asks a question, thanking you for a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
And then asks, I greatly appreciate your call to complicate Jewish history and the concepts we use to analyze it. I wonder if perhaps your argument also needs to complicate the category of Jew as well. Can we really assume that the Jew who participated in the Indian Wars is the same Jew who fought for Indigenous rights? There are infamously many Jewish traditions as well as moral and philosophical orientations. At what point do we start to question considering all of these different groups and lines of thought to be one and the same?
Yeah, that's certainly important. I think that's important to do with all Jewish history, because there are so many Jews from so many different places, and they keep changing as a people. So this is a kind of a different kind of Jewish continuity problem than what's normally talked about Jewish continuity. It's like a what's that? Whose ship is it? There's the ancient scholars know this. Who is it? It's someone's ship. This tale of this ship that sails from Athens to Sparta or wherever, and brings.
Misha's helping you out in the chat. It says Theseus.
Theseus ship. So it's a Theseus ship question. So for those who are not following my line of thinking here, these are the ship that carries all of the wood boards and the sails and the ropes. And as it chugs along the ocean surface, it dismantles parts of the ship, casts them off, and rebuilds itself as it goes. So by the time it reaches its destination, every single piece, every single board and mast of the ship is different from the one that left. And the question is it the same ship, that leaves and arrives? And this is certainly a question about Jews and who they are. And of course, we want to avoid Jewish essentialism. I try to pay some attention in the book to the differences between the Jews of the late frontier, first generation of German and Yiddish-speaking immigrants who arrive in the West, and their children and grandchildren who are these enfranchised Jews of the East. Even a single generation later, they have different sensibilities, they have different commitments. America's changed, the nature of Jewishness has changed. Yes, I mean, there may be some study that could do more detailed work about Jewish indigenous encounters that specifically dealt with Jews of color or with Sephardic Jewish immigration. Maybe these encounters look somewhat differently as well. So I think all these are important to do, important distinctions to make, but perhaps not so much that they just obliterate the possibility of writing Jewish history, even while we have to say that there's change over time. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but
I think it certainly complicates, the categories we have to think about in this, right? So is there connectivity versus continuity and distinction as well? Just to kind of take it a little bit back to the origins of this project, I think some in the audience might be interested to know what kind of initially led you to this particular project. Is there something from your own personal history that brought this about, or was it just something of deep interest for you? What kind of sparked your interest in this topic?
Thanks for that question. I was an anthropology major as an undergrad in my first master's, and I wanted nothing to do with Jewish studies, although I did kind of internalize some of the basic ideas of anthropology and the basic claims that you're shaped by your culture in ways that you don't always see, and this kind of led me to contemplate my own Jewishness. I had planned, when I thought about going back to grad school and doing a PhD, I was hoping to write a dissertation about Jewish anthropologists, about Boaz and Sapir, and there meant like 2 generations of their students, who I referred to in the talk as the kind of scholars, men and women, who put anthropology, kind of took it out of the museums and took it out of the evolutionary framework that it had been in, and pioneered this idea of cultural relativism and established all these first anthropology departments across the continent. And in my view, there were a lot of, disproportionately number of Jewish anthropologists. They were also more Jews that wanted to go to the academy that, found their way to psychology and economics and social, other social sciences, because they were shut out of history and philosophy and English departments. But the anthropologists were particularly interesting to me because they had a kind of anti-racist agenda, and they aimed to speak to white audiences about pluralism and difference, and they used American Indians as their subjects because they believed that they could make some claims about human nature by studying, so-called primitive peoples. So I wanted to do a project where I basically took these anthropologists' ideas about humans and life and intersect it with American Jewish history. And no anthropology department wanted me because they said, no, you have to do field work to be an anthropologist. And I didn't have any background in history, didn't take a single history course in my first master's or undergraduate degree. So I started learning my chops a little bit. And then as I started doing research, there was actually an incident that happened in Canada while I was working on my PhD, where a First Nations leader named David Hennekew made some very gruesome anti-Semitic remarks at a health conference with First Nations leaders. And I thought, oh, how strange. The Canadian organized Jewish world was up in arms about it and was really kind of flabbergasted. And I thought, okay, here is a situation of kind of one Jewish indigenous encounter and a very different batch over here with these anthropologists. Maybe I'll just push pause on my anthropologist project and cast a wide net and go to the archives and see what I can find about when and how and where Jews and Native Americans might have interacted with one another. And I went on this giant fishing expedition, and the book is the result.
Well, that's an amazing story. I think that it sort of highlights how academic research can kind of just be about a journey as much as it is about a kind of goal that you're going towards.
Yeah, in this case, it was. I mean, I think some people start with an intervention in mind. They have a kind of argument that they need to make, and they figure out how to articulate it and what sources to use, and that's good. I mean, there wouldn't be any more books on Lincoln if you didn't have something new to, anything on the Civil War, unless you had to make an intervention. But there are also works that kind of try to explore new things, and this was this was one of those. And it was fun to do.
Nice. So we have one more question for the evening from Isabel Hedrick. Where did the different provenances of Jewish immigrants factor into the larger story you tell? That is, those who came in the mid-19th century from Central Europe versus those who had come as part of the waves from Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. And one can even extend that back earlier to the Sephardic Jews who came in the 18th century as well. Did you examine this, and did this affect their understandings of Native Americans?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've got that one before, and I think it's probably just an accurate criticism that I don't do enough with that point. I mean, what I will say is that, each of these kind of waves or cohorts certainly maintained their filial connections with other Jews of those cohorts. So Sephardic Jews in the Atlantic world, German-speaking Jews. So like the German-speaking Jews who arrived, a couple of decades before the so-called Russian Jews, certainly had more concentrated presence in certain states. They in Arizona, New Mexico, and had very tight business contacts, which happened to put them into relationships with Native Americans. And given that they arrived in the specific decades as they did, since these Jews, of course, weren't shaping federal policy, there weren't enough of any of these waves of Jews to be really making a major difference in the overall kind of American encounter, the state's shaping of Indigenous lives, and yet they fit into these very local contexts based on where and when they came. So they definitely track along wave patterns, but I don't think that the differences between how, say, the quote German Jewish immigrants thought about and interacted with Native peoples was different from the way the Polish or Eastern European Jews did. Based on that difference, what was much more important was what had changed in America and in the local circumstances, state by state, because decades had passed, so policy was different. So they were really, I don't think those differences mattered as much as the differences on the ground in the circumstances that shaped their encounters.
Great. Thank you, Professor Koffman. And that is our last question for the evening. So I want to invite you all to, again, join me in thanking Professor Koffman for a wonderful and engaging lecture. I believe he just put his email in the chat for everyone. If you want to reach out to him, if you have additional questions.
I did. Feel free to write if you've got any comments or want to continue the dialogue in any way. It's always nice to have interlocutors.
Great. Thank you for that willingness to continue the conversation. And I just want to wish everyone a wonderful evening, and invite you to stay attuned to events at both the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies at the University of Oklahoma and the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. We'd love to have you at future events, both virtual and increasingly in person. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.